Indigenous sovereignty often gets taken up in academic and policy discourse as though simply asserting it is enough to make it material. But in practice, Indigenous nations are constantly navigating systems designed to undermine their ability to enact sovereignty, whether territorial, legal, or digital. Digital sovereignty, in particular, gets complicated because it depends on access to infrastructure that Indigenous communities rarely control. Even when nations assert data governance, self determined online spaces, or community led networks, they still contend with settler state policies, funding limitations, and extractive digital economies that dictate access and visibility. It raises the question, is sovereignty enough, or does the conversation need to shift towards something else, like autonomy, digital kinship networks, or alternative infrastructures that bypass reliance on state or corporate systems? In their book, Indigenous Data Sovereignty and Policy, Maggie Walter, Tahu Kukatai, Stephanie Russo Carroll, and Desi Rodriguez Lone Bear draw on similar Indigenous policy environments in Canada, New Zealand, Australia, and the US to analyze how Indigenous data is used by governments to govern Indigenous peoples. The authors are describing a state policy on Indigenous affairs. These are governmental policies created to regulate, control, or engage with Indigenous peoples, lands, and rights. These often reinforce colonial power structures, where through legislation like the Indian Act in Canada that manage access to Indigenous identity and rights, or resource extraction policies that disregard Indigenous sovereignty. The authors argue that state led Indigenous policy is framed around disadvantage and developmental disparity, as seen in government mission statements. These policies claim collaboration with Indigenous peoples, but fail to integrate Indigenous worldviews, Indigenous led policy, and Indigenous governance frameworks. A key component of these policies is the use of data as an evidence base. An evidence based policy is one that is informed by rigorous research, data, and lived experience rather than ideology, assumptions, or political convenience. It integrates empirical evidence, whether from scientific studies, community led research, or Indigenous knowledge systems, to create effective and just policies. However, the authors argue that evidence based policy consistently presents a narrative of Indigenous overrepresentation in negative socioeconomic indicators, such as incarceration rates. While these statistics are factually accurate, they are not neutral. They reflect colonial assumptions about what data is collected and how it is interpreted, reinforcing deficit based narratives rather than Indigenous priorities. The ongoing framing of Indigenous disadvantage through government reports reveals a persistent pattern of policy failure. In Australia, a comparison between a 1858 inquiry into Aboriginal welfare and the 2016 Overcoming Indigenous Disadvantage report shows striking similarities in language and findings, despite over 150 years of policy intervention. Indigenous data sovereignty challenges this approach by asserting Indigenous rights over data collection, access, management, and use. Indigenous data sovereignty has presented itself as global advocacy movement and an emerging scholarly field that seeks to shift data governance away from state control and towards Indigenous self-determination in policymaking. Two dominant explanations for these policy failures emerge, the authors argue. One argues that Indigenous policy is ineffective due to a lack of meaningful Indigenous participation in decision making, leading to policies imposed by non Indigenous bureaucrats with little understanding of Indigenous realities. The other, rooted in Western and capitalist individualism, attributes Indigenous inequality to personal failings, claiming that Indigenous individuals have not taken advantage of state provided opportunities. The latter view shifts blame onto Indigenous peoples rather than critiquing systemic barriers or colonial policy structures. In their book Indigenous Data Sovereignty, Walter Kukatai, Russo Carroll, and Rodriguez Lombert argue that the government led policy approaches, failures, and data across Canada, New Zealand, Australia, and the US reveal systemic patterns of neglect, resulting in anti Indigenous racism being ingrained in policy. To understand this ongoing cycle, the authors draw on James C. Scott's Seeing Like a State, which was published in 1998, which outlines four conditions for large scale policy failure. The first is administrative ordering, where the state simplifies and categorizes society through data collection, such as censuses. But this process distorts Indigenous realities. Data becomes tools for state control rather than reflection of authentic Indigenous experiences. So much gets lost in the data and statistics, namely the lived realities and political will of Indigenous communities. The second is high modernist ideology, which is a belief that scientific and technological process drives policy, often without critical reflection. This is evident in past assimilationist policies and contemporary uses of big data, such as predictive risk modeling, which disproportionately target Indigenous populations in Australia. The third is authoritarian state power. Governments enforce these policies through coercion, as seen in welfare restrictions on Aboriginal communities in Australia or police violence against Indigenous land defenders in the US. Lastly, there is limited Indigenous resistance. In settler colonial societies, colonial power imbalances persist, making Indigenous communities frequent subjects of social policy experimentation, reinforcing state control over Indigenous lives. The authors call Indigenous policy in Canada, New Zealand, Australia, and the US a complex of failure. The authors cite economist Albert O. Hirschman and his term Francosomania, a bureaucratic mindset that normalizes failure and prevents meaningful change. Francosomania, or policy failure, is characterized by external control. Indigenous policies are developed by non Indigenous outsiders who diagnose so called Indigenous problems and impose solutions without deep community engagement. This leads to a lack of cumulative knowledge. Policies are reactionary, failing to build on past knowledge. There's also an issue of resulting reactionary shifts. Policymakers rapidly replace failed initiatives with new ones without assessing previous shortcomings, reinforcing a cycle of ineffective interventions. In settler colonial societies, a systemic normalization of failure means Indigenous policy failures are expected and met with resignation rather than accountability. Indigenous policy failures are business as usual in settler colonial societies. Policymakers ritualistically acknowledge failure but continue to implement the same ineffective strategies. The authors argue that public policy is the core function of the state, shaped by a bureaucratic infrastructure that both serves and reinforces state interests. Indigenous data plays a central role in this process, acting as the lens through which the state sees Indigenous people. Indigenous data overwhelmingly focuses on difference and disadvantage, reinforcing narratives of Indigenous peoples as a problematic population. Further, data that does not fit state development measures are largely absent, erasing Indigenous perspectives outside of state defined categories. This selective data construction upholds national myths while obscuring the colonial foundations of the state. Following Scott's concept of high modernist ideology, policymakers may genuinely believe they are advancing Indigenous communities, but they do so through a bureaucratic system locked into a complex of failure. The authors argue that this is an intentional failure of colonialism that has plagued Indigenous policy as a purposeful means of keeping Indigenous populations in a subordinated position while denying their sovereignties. Indigenous peoples are perpetually framed as a population in need, shifting attention away from Indigenous rights and sovereignty. The state positions itself as a benevolent helper rather than a colonial inheritor of stolen land. Given that the political treaties that made way for the states of US, Canada, Australia, and New Zealand were treaties with Indigenous nations. To deny Indigenous sovereignty is to deny the legitimacy of those settler colonial states. These portrayals are not incidental, they are essential to maintaining the state's hegemonic narratives. The result is a self reinforcing cycle where Indigenous peoples are continuously framed as failing to meet Euro majority standards, justifying further intervention while obscuring Indigenous agency. In their book Indigenous Data Sovereignty and Policy, Walter, Kukatai, Russo Carroll, and Rodriguez Lombert argue that the solution is Indigenous data sovereignty, which is enacted through Indigenous data governance. In Indigenous studies, the concept of governance is often broadly applied as a philosophical concept rather than an applied or ethical framework. These types of frameworks work by acknowledging systemic barriers in policy and gesturing to inclusion and reform as the solution. For instance, Indigenous data sovereignty asserts Indigenous rights by involving Indigenous decision making in the entire data life cycle, focusing on governance over the data generated by state infrastructure rather than removal of Indigenous interest and investment in relations with the state. The state's reluctance to see Indigenous people on their own terms stems from entrenched national narratives in settler colonial countries like Canada, Australia, the US, and New Zealand, which rely on deficit based data to maintain control and avoid addressing systemic issues such as discrimination, trauma, and dispossession linked to colonization. Well, it's true that Indigenous peoples require not just control over existing data, but also access to disaggregated and contextualized data that represents their lived realities, distinct cultures, and priorities, broadly stating that Indigenous governance structures need data to manage resources, make decisions, and implement policies. And that data governance with Indigenous communities is vital for support self determination, and strengthening evidence based decision making. However, it does little to address the felt and systemic phenomenologies, which is to say, lived realities of Indigenous communities, peoples, and life under these states. At the core of this governance is Indigenous leadership within colonial governance, ensuring that data aligns with Indigenous values and priorities, such as access to relevant data and the ability to protect and control it. Well, this rolls off the tongue. Any Indigenous person working in policy knows the various levels of intervention within government and industry that would need entire overhauls of cultures and meaningful engagement with Indigenous positions, a future that many of the marginalized peoples policy researchers speak over do not have time to wait for. The idea of Indigenous data sovereignty is not expansive enough to hold all the needs and realities of Indigenous peoples in Canada, Australia, the US, and New Zealand, with vastly different phenomenologies and governance structures, especially because of its reliance on a discourse of sovereignty to always align itself with the legitimacy of the state. Many Indigenous youth leaders have begun to ask what comes after a government managed vision of sovereignty. Would that future exist beyond the state in a space of abolition? This further brings up the question of Indigenous sovereignty and sovereignty broadly, denoting a landlessness and placelessness of anyone who is not sovereign, who is not Indigenous or a settler, and what this means for migrant communities and Black communities when Indigenous peoples reinforce an Anglo colonial state structure repeating instead of kinship with said communities. This is not to say Indigenous sovereignties are not valid, but it's important in this next era of Indigenous policy studies to be rigorous because too many communities are being lost in a one size fits all policy perspective. To this, our pre colonial sovereignty could and should exist outside of any nation state and within the realm of our effective kinship, not just our political will. Ashley Corrado Morford and Jeffrey Anslus's paper, Indigenous Sovereignty in Digital Territory, explores the relationship between Indigenous land based relations and the Internet, arguing that the common perception of cyberspace as landless overlooks the deep connections between digital technologies and the physical world. The authors critique the historical framing of cyberspace as neutral or universal, instead highlighting the importance of land-based thinking in understanding how Indigenous peoples interact with digital technologies. The study focuses on hashtag native Twitter, a hashtag used by Indigenous peoples on Twitter to discuss experiences, cultures, and sovereignty. Through a qualitative analysis, the authors identify 6 themes: land based cyberpedagogy, rematriations of land based relations and digital environments, digital bridges to homelands, networked culture navigation, settler colonialism in cyberspace, and Indigenous data sovereignty and cyber justice. This text emphasizes that the internet is not landless, but is rooted in land based infrastructures, and discusses how Indigenous peoples use cyberspace to resist settler colonialism and assert sovereignty. By challenging the landless conception of cyberspace, the authors contribute to an Indigenous centered critique of digital spaces and suggest that cyberspace, much like physical space, is shaped by political, cultural, and ethical relations to the land. However, this argument is an example of how the sovereignty discourse of Indigenous studies often fails in a thorough analysis of sovereignty and the land in relation to technology and cyberspace. While the internet is certainly a space of community building for Indigenous people, it is by no means a neutral space, which many internet historians have written about for years. The authors do acknowledge this briefly, but then fall back on a pure land ideology, itself derived from colonial logic, linked to Christianity and terra nullius, to describe Indigenous knowledge throughout the paper. As discussed in an earlier video, which will be linked in the description, the internet is an immensely destructive technology that actively undermines Indigenous life and seeks to colonize Indigenous people somatically, haptically, mentally, and physically. Kinship and land are not metaphors, especially digital metaphors. Colonial technologies are technologies of destruction, and romanticized notions otherwise, even if based on Indigenous knowledge, are technofascism. Further, Indigenous Twitter, as discussed in this paper, is perhaps the greatest playground for hologram life and digital red face, which is also discussed in a previous video and will be linked in the description. How could digital red face ever be associated with any form of Indigenous land based knowledge, kinship, or life? Why does Indigenous politics continue to fall on a standard of relating to the state, so much so that the metaphor of sovereignty has become another way to line us to the state and its technologies? Why do we align with white normativity and a relationship with the state? Black scholars have argued it is to elevate ourselves above the enslaved and the displaced. This is why many Indigenous youth and activists are arguing it's time to rethink our relationship to sovereignty and advocate instead for abolition now